The Bible is not just a book, it is the very Word of God. Its pages tell us that all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. When we read it, we step into the truths of God that shape our lives. His Word gives direction and hope. The psalmist declared, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." Every page points us closer to Him and steadies us in the ebb and flow of life. Just as our bodies need food, our souls need the nourishment of Scripture. Jesus said, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." His word strengthens us, feeds us, and reminds us of His promises. When we open the Bible, we open our hearts to God's voice. The invitation is simple. Open His Word, listen to His voice, and let it transform you from the inside out.
Well, welcome to all who are joining us today, and I'm really glad you're with us for this talk because for the next 3 weeks we're going to do something a bit unique. We are going to be turning our sermon time into a classroom time, and we are going to be teaching a short 3-week course on the Bible. And we've titled this series, A New Way of Seeing the Bible. It's not really a new way, but it might be a new way to some of us as we have time over the next 3 weeks to talk specifically about what the Bible is and how do we read it? How do we use it? How do we make sense of it? The reality of it is a lot of us, even those of us who have been in the church for a long time, have never had the opportunity to learn some of the most foundational principles about the Bible or about understanding the Bible. And you may have heard me tell the story in the past that back when I went to seminary, one of the first things we had to do was take an entry placement exam in both the Old and New Testament. Now understand, I had grown up all my life in the church and knew from a young age that I wanted to be a minister. Felt like I had a pretty good background in the Bible, and I failed both of those exams. And it made me realize that a lot of us who have been a part of the church, who have been around the Bible for a long time, sometimes don't understand some of the most basic aspects of the Bible itself or of how the Bible is to be read or approached. So, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to try to do what a seminary curriculum does in 3 years. We are going to try to give a very comprehensive overview of the Old Testament today on week 1. Then next week we're going to look at the New Testament. And then on week 3, probably the most important week of the series, we're going to talk about how we read the Bible, how we use it, how we make sense of it in the present day. So I want to very much encourage you to be part of all 3 weeks, but certainly make sure you're tuning in 3 weeks from now as we talk again about how the Bible is read, how the Bible is used. And again, we're going to approach this in very much a classroom format. If you've taken one of our classes before, you know that's a pretty casual approach to teaching this subject matter. We're going to use a lot of visual aids. We're going to be writing on the iPad quite a bit. And I'll also say, you know, again, if you've been in one of our classes before, that whenever there's a point of controversy or a diversity of opinion from biblical scholars, you know that we try to present all the views to allow you to make your own informed decision as to what you think or believe. And I'll continue that practice as we get into some issues that might have some controversy around them in this series. The only time I'll be emphatic about a position is when it is clearly the consensus of present-day biblical scholarship. So keep that in mind as we go through. So when we talk about the Bible, what is it? Well, we know the Bible is a collection of 39 books from antiquity. We'll say more about that in just a minute. And in our present English Christian versions of the biblical text, those 39 books are divided into two big sections: the Old Testament at the beginning of the Bible, the New Testament being the second half of the Bible. And today, what we're going to do is focus on the Old Testament. And I see I printed this wrong. We're talking about 66 books from antiquity, the Old Testament having 39 and the New Testament having 27. So let's begin by talking specifically about the Old Testament. Again, 39 books from antiquity, 39 books that represent the literature of ancient Israel. What are these books like? Well, we've got some history, we've got stories, we've got poetry, we've got some political writing, we've got some religious writing. These 39 books, they're a real mix of literary style. And that's important to know because oftentimes when we approach the Bible, we approach it very one-dimensional. We say it's the Bible. And we treat all the writings the same. That's something we should not do because there is a great diversity of writings contained in these 39 Old Testament books. These books cover a time period of ancient Israel's history and cultural life from roughly 2000 BCE down to about 400 BCE, and a couple notes about annotations here. When we use dates from the ancient world, it's hard to be precise. Once in a while, we're able to give a precise date. Most of the time, we're given a generalization, so we often use this C in front of the date, which is just an abbreviation for the Latin word circa, which means around or about. The other thing to talk about is BCE and CE. BCE before the Common Era. CE Common Era. In the past, we often used BC before Christ, or AD, Anno Domini, or Year of Our Lord. This is to be preferred both because this is what is accepted by scholars regardless of whether they're Christian or not, but also because it's more accurate. It used to be thought that Jesus was born in the year 1 of the Common Era, and so anything before this was before Christ. What we now know is that Jesus is probably born around the year 4 BC or BCE, This dating is off. When we use BC, it's off by 3 or 4 years. So quick word about why we use the date formulas that we do. But again, the Old Testament, we're talking about a period of time from roughly 2000 down to about 400 BCE. This is a long stretch of time. This is almost a 2,000-year history. So just put that in present day terms. Think back 2,000 years. That's how much history is covered or experienced during the course of the Old Testament. And again, over this time period, we're getting a picture of all different kinds of ancient Israelite literature. Once again, just by review, we've got some historical accounts, we've got some stories, we've got some poetry, we've got some political discourse, we've got some religious discourse, and we've got other forms of literary genres in the Old Testament. It's a real mix. In fact, the best way to think about the Old Testament is like you thought about those anthologies from high school or college. Remember, like the Norton Anthology of World Literature, where you had a collection of a lot of different literary types all grouped together into this one volume. This is what the Old Testament is in regards to the literature of ancient Israel. Now, these books are grouped together in some clear groupings. In the Jewish Bible, or the Hebrew Old Testament, which again would have been the Bible that Jesus was familiar with, these 39 books are grouped in 3 different categories. The law, this is the Torah, you often hear it referred to, or sometimes it's called the teachings. The law, the prophets, and the writings. I think just one T there. This is the grouping of these 39 books in the Hebrew Bible. The English Bible breaks these up into 5 groups, and if you've had a chance to study the Old Testament before, you may be familiar with these. The law, or sometimes referred to as the Pentateuch, the books of history, the books of poetry, the major prophets, and the minor prophets. In English versions of the Old Testament, or English groupings of these books, these are how the 39 are divided. And again, you can see you've got very different forms of literature represented here. Now, these 39 books are written by multiple authors. Many of the authors, we don't know who they were or anything about them. A lot of the books seem to be a collection of different authors' writings pulled together by one author or by one editor. That's particularly evident, for instance, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch or the Torah. And these books are all written originally in Hebrew. which would have been the language of ancient Israel as it is the language of Israel now. So originally, here's a picture of the first page of the book of Genesis from a Hebrew Bible. Hebrew is read right to left instead of left to right. So when you open a book in Hebrew, you start in the back and you read it toward the front, at least from our perspective. Originally written in Hebrew, and we don't have any of the original writings of the Old Testament. We don't have any of the original copies of these books. Instead, what we have is copies of those originals called manuscripts. And here's the thing. Sometimes the manuscripts differ a little bit. In the ancient world, they were making copies of the original, not using a Xerox machine or a photocopier. They were copying them by hand. And sometimes there are some variations due to error or due to the copyist making changes that they thought were important to make. And everything we possess in English version of the Old Testament, it's a translation from Hebrew into English. And you know, if you've ever translated from one language to another, you know there are often times where different English words can translate the same word in a foreign language or foreign context. And so because of the differentiations in manuscripts, and because of the difference in translating from Hebrew into English, you often have variations in English translations, which is why if you have a Bible and your friend has a Bible and they're different translations or different versions, they sometimes read differently. Now, the good thing is, none of the variations or differences are really significant. I mean, there might be a few that scholars would point to that would say are pretty substantial. But for the most part, they don't affect the meaning or the understanding of the text in any significant way. But there are differences and variations. And because all we have in English is translations from the Hebrew into English, generally speaking, the more recent the translation, probably the better or more close to the original it's going to be. That's because as time has gone on, we make more and more discoveries from the ancient world. We learn more and more about these ancient languages. Generally, newer versions are more close to the original probably than older versions. And I just say that because you know, oftentimes people will say, well, what translation of the Bible, or what version should I use? My answer is always any English translation or version is good. But generally speaking, the more recent ones, the better. So for instance, you know, the King James Version, which many of us grew up with, was first translated in 1611. The New Revised Standard Version, which is the text that I use usually to teach from and preach from, was done in 1989, and it was just updated again in the early 2000s. So in many places, you'll find that modern scholarship has done a much better job with the translation than from some of the older translations. Now, let's get into some interesting stuff. These 39 books in the Old Testament, grouped as law, as prophets, as writings, they're not arranged in chronological order. And this really throws the reader of the Old Testament when they start to read through these books in English. Because we're used to reading through a book narrative that usually flows in a linear direction in chronological order, maybe a little backtracking, maybe a little circulating around, but you start here and the final chapter ends here. This is not how the Old Testament works. So, of these 39 books, the first 17 are roughly in chronological order. They roughly take us from about the year 2000 BCE down to about the year 400 BCE. These are the books of Genesis through Ezra, or Esther, I'm sorry. But this is just the first 17 books. The next 5 books are primarily poetry, and these books fit at various places in this stretch of history. These books fit in different places within the context of these first 17 books. And then books 24 through 39, which are primarily the writings of the prophets, these again fit within the context of these first 17 books. So oftentimes when a person says, I want to try to read through the Bible, and they start with the Old Testament, and they get along fairly well until they get to the end of book 17, the end of the book of Esther, and then things start to get a little bizarre because you're jumping all around historically. It's because they are not, the books of the Bible, the books of the Old Testament are not laid out in pure chronological fashion. So whenever we're reading the books of poetry or the books of the prophets, we're always orienting them back into those first 17 books, which would be the books of the law and the books of history. There is very much a storyline, however, that flows through the Old Testament. And that storyline starts with what we might call prehistory. This is largely the book of Genesis. This is the creation stories, the flood story, the account of Cain and Abel, figures like Seth and Lamech. We talk about this as prehistory because the information in this section of the story, it's not datable. Datable, not datable, which means can you find someone to take you out for dinner? Datable, we can't put specific dates to them. And this section is not technical, despite often attempts in the past to make the accounts of this section of the Bible, like the creation or the flood story, to make them technical. They clearly are not. They're general literary statements about the nature of the universe and about the nature of the God who is behind the universe. And again, we call this whole section of the Bible prehistory. The first historically datable or locatable events in the biblical record comes next with the patriarchs. This is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Called the patriarchs because they're considered the fathers of ancient Israel, and we encounter them midway through the book of Genesis. the rest of the book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus is an outworking of their stories. You may remember one of Jacob's sons named Joseph is a catalyst for the ancient nation of Israel to wind up in Egypt. And from Egypt we have the Exodus, and this is the whole story of Moses and the 10 plagues. From Egypt we enter the Promised Land. And again, I'm moving over details very quickly here. In the Promised Land, we establish a monarchy. The monarchy divides through civil war. We do know this date quite well, at least we think, 931 BCE. And again, if we were to put some dates to this, we would put the patriarchs around 2000, the Exodus from Egypt probably around 1250, the establishment of the monarchy around 1000, and again, these are all roundabout dates. The division of the monarchy in 931 BC. This leads to the defeat of the northern kingdom of Israel. And again, a date we do know very reliably, 722 BCE. Then the defeat of the southern kingdom of Judah in 586 BCE. And then the eventual restoration of the nation of Judah beginning in 539 BCE. And the Old Testament ends with a longing for a deliverer, a longing for a Messiah, a hope for the future, or for a future deliverer around 400 BCE. It's a story of the birth of a nation. Some prehistory, how did this all begin? How did the world get here? How did it all start? The beginning of a particular family, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the growth of that family into a small nation enslaved in Egypt, God's miraculous deliverance out of slavery through the Exodus, the establishment of the people in the Promised Land governed by the 10 Commandments and the subsequent laws coming from Mount Sinai, the eventual establishment of a monarchy, the demise of that monarchy into two separate kingdoms, the fall of the northern kingdom, the fall of the southern kingdom, the eventual restoration of the southern kingdom, but still under foreign dominance and control, and the longing for the day that God would one day intervene again and deliver the nation from oppression. This is the storyline that runs through the Old Testament, again, found in the first 17 books, Genesis through Esther, with the remaining books of poetry and prophecy all being commentary or further explanation of this. Now, here's the most important part of the talk today, and we're just about done. There is an overarching theme, narrative, meta-narrative, whatever you want to call it, that runs through these 39 books of the Old Testament. And scholars will somewhat debate the specifics of it, but the overall theme is quite clear. And to label this theme, I'm going to use a phrase or terminology that Father Richard Rohr uses often in his writings. The overarching narrative is the move from order to disorder to reorder. This is the movement or the narrative of these 39 books. It's seen in a lot of small ways in the 39 books, so think about it. The Bible opens with this story of creation, fall, redemption. We have the story of the patriarchs, slavery in Egypt, Exodus. We have the story of the Exodus, the disorder of the wilderness wanderings, and the reordering of the promised land. And of course, the big example of this, and I would argue really the example that holds it all together, is the move from the monarchy to exile to restoration. The United Monarchy around the year 1000, exile for the southern kingdom in Babylon in 586, the northern kingdom in Assyria in 722, and then the restoration of the southern kingdom starting in 539. The narrative or the flow is very much this: order, disorder, reorder. But it's really not quite like that. It's more like this: order, disorder, reorder. Because the reorder is always better than the original order, even if it doesn't appear that way. And of course, if you're thinking ahead, the New Testament picks up on this same theme, except in the New Testament, as we'll see next week, it's not order, disorder, reorder. It's life, death, resurrection. Now, because of time, we'll say much more about this next week, but I want you to keep in mind this is the overall theme, narrative of the Old Testament. And this is largely why we read it. Certainly, we read it because these ancient literary works help us understand the history and the culture of ancient Israel. And remember, the history and the culture of ancient Israel is what Christianity emerges from. Because Jesus is an Israelite, the disciples are Israelites. Christianity emerges initially as just a subsect of Judaism. The writings of the Old Testament are the literary history of ancient Judaism and the literary history on which Christianity is built or emerges. So there's a huge value in us understanding that history. In fact, I would argue that you really can't understand the teachings of Jesus apart from understanding the history of the Old Testament. But maybe even more significantly, these narratives, this poetry, these poetical and political and religious writings, this flow from order to disorder to reorder, here's the thing: it gives voice to the universal human experience. And yes, it does that in a context a couple of thousand, 3,000 even years ago. Yes, it does that from the perspective of the ancient world, but it is giving voice to the universal human experience that we know today, which is why so often when you read a text from these ancient authors, you say, oh my gosh, that speaks so directly to me. These texts give a voice outside of our culture to the realities we're experiencing within our culture. And there is a tremendous value in listening to these voices. Listen, we're out of time for this week. Next week, we'll pick up with a bit more on the Old Testament and then move into the New Testament. Remember, week 3, we're going to talk about how you put it all together and make sense of it. Look forward to joining you with this talk next week.